being in a big company has its benefits, merits, right? It's safe, right? So when you're willing to consider new ideas, when you're willing to consider new opportunities, when you're willing to meet new people and go to new places, things start to come to you. And I think what I've seen, at least in the past 10 months since I left the corporate world, my world opened up. There's so many opportunities that are coming to me now. I can't say yes to everything. So one of the challenges is I'm learning to say no. Because at one point you can't say yes to everything. You know, you have to stay true to your purpose. And my purpose, I just explained to you, enabling leaders and organizations to be future ready. Do well and do good. Do well, be the best I can be in all the roles I play, but do good for the world. So it's important to spend time doing something good for the world.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, I have last 2 questions. One, maybe many audience want to know about it. What was the biggest challenge? Like from the biggest world-class company, and then bye-bye, and then you decided to be an entrepreneur.
Wow, that is a huge question, and it is a challenge. I'm not going to put sugar on it. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is a challenge because being in a big company has its benefits, merits, right? It's safe. You're part of a big ship. If I had a problem with my computer, IT department comes, right? If I have any issues with people relations, I sit down with HR. My expenses, I had accounting, I had an EA, I had an assistant who was amazing. So, I had all these things. In a way, when you work in a big company, you are a bit spoiled, right? And I appreciated it always. When you go independent, that's all on your own. Your computer's not working, well, figure it out, Expenses, you do it yourself, Payroll, I do it myself. I go to the bank and I do the transfers, all these things. But I quite like that. I quite like the independence of that part of being an entrepreneur. I think the one thing I missed early on was walking into an office where there were lots of people and there was a buzz and there was energy, and walking around, and there's something in Japanese, the gemba walk. I like to walk around the gemba and be with the people, and that was suddenly gone. But on the other hand, I get to do this, right? And I get to meet people like you, and every day I'm meeting amazing people and I'm engaging with leadership teams, individual leaders, a variety of kind of people. So I'm really enjoying that part. But I think the freedom is incredible. When you go independent, that freedom, then it's about how you use it. And these are also muscles that need to be built. The entrepreneurial muscle is an important one. But I'm enjoying it. I mean, it's a challenge, but it's been fun. 10 months and I'm already in. And of course, things you can't imagine come up. New opportunities come. To be a little bit spiritual for a moment, there's something about the universe that when you are open to things come, right? So when you're willing to consider new ideas, when you're willing to consider new opportunities, when you're willing to meet new people and go to new places, things start to come to you. And I think what I've seen, at least in the past 10 months since I left the corporate world, my world opened up. There's so many opportunities that are coming to me now. I can't say yes to everything. So one of the challenges is I'm learning to say no. Because at one point you can't say yes to everything. You have to stay true to your purpose. And my purpose, I just explained to you, enabling leaders and organizations to be future ready. And my guiding, let's say, mantra is to do well and do good. Do well and do good. Do well, be the best I can be in all the roles I play, but do good for the world. So it's important to spend time doing something good for the world, volunteering, etc. Right? So, so that's it. Long answer to your question, but less challenging, more exciting, actually.
Amazing. And then so actually many my founder friends from San Francisco, they are struggling to say no. They are struggling to prioritize because of like you, the founder leadership who has good personality, amazing personality, love to help people. But our life is like 24 hours and 7 days, right? So how do you prioritize. If you have some tips,
Yeah,
please let us know.
Yeah, sure. So there's a technique that I use that's actually pretty well known, rocks and pebbles. I use the rocks and pebbles approach. So first of all, you start with, what are your rocks? The big ones, the things that are going to change the world. If I move these rocks today, it's going to create impact. And what are the pebbles? That's all the other stuff. Okay. And I think a lot of us get caught in the trap of, we put all the rocks and pebbles on the table and we think everything on the table are rocks. It's not true. I mean, at one point, we only have a capacity as human beings, as you said, 24/7. I mean, there's only so much time in a day to really make an impact and do it effectively. Because we also know that we need to push pause, refresh, recharge, so we can come back stronger. So I usually focus on 3 to 4 rocks per day. So, when I wake up in the morning, okay, these are my rocks. 3 to 4 max. Sometimes it's less. And yeah, I might get to the pebbles later. But if I don't get to the pebbles, it's okay. So that's one thing that really works well for me. What are your rocks? And then also make sure that everything you're doing connects with your purpose. That's why it's so important to have that purpose. What is your why every morning? Why are you doing this? Now, some people say, I'm doing it to make money. Some will say, okay, well, if making money is one of your key objectives, great. Is that rock that you've put on the table today, is that really going to help you get closer to that goal, right? I would say that, making money, and I've been around a lot of entrepreneurs that are so passionate about making money. And what I've discovered with many who have made money, and I've been around those as well, been very fortunate to kind of be around that, is that they still find something is missing. It's very common, right? Someone builds a company, sells it for a lot of money, and suddenly has a lot of money. They still feel something is missing. And that's where I come back to my idea that, purpose needs to be bigger than something you measure, the what, and so on. It has to be deeper. It has to be back to what I described as do well, do good. Do well, okay, sell your company, make a lot of money. What are you going to do with that money now? How are you going to do good for the world? And we see this with so many famous, successful business people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and so on, who are giving away a lot of their money for this exact reason. Yeah, so I would encourage people to think about their purpose more deeply beyond that measurable outcome. Building a big company which is profitable and making a lot of money, okay, that's good. But if you were to say, I want to do that because it enables people to have employment, I can create employment, and it enables them to take care of their families and have a better life. Okay, that's a totally different purpose, which makes better sense. Yeah.
I love this philosophy, and then we need to face over ourselves, and then we have to writing or journaling to deep dive into find our real purpose, right? How do you do? Do you do journaling or do you do type? What do you think?
So, I've tried journaling, I've tried writing it down and so on.
I love that.
Some people, everyone has their way, and the beauty is it's kind of like climbing Mount Fuji. I think there's 3 official trails to go up Mount Fuji. There's Yoshida Trail, there's all these different trails. But actually, there are some secret trails. But it's the same thing, right? If you want to get to that goal, to find your purpose, to build, a leading company or whatever it is you're trying to do, there's different trails. There's different ways to get to that same destination. Journaling's one way. I actually, what's worked for me, Kaori, is every morning I go for a walk. I mentioned this. I did this when I was in India. I do it now before I came here this morning. I went for a nice walk. That's my thinking time. And I trained my brain to think in a way which is future focused. So, one of the things that we all discover, I think, all along the journey is that generally stress, comes from things that happened yesterday. It doesn't come from things that are going to happen tomorrow. That kind of stress is more excitement, maybe apprehension, maybe nervousness, but that's good stress. But when we reflect back on yesterday too much, that's stress that we carry, right? Something that happened yesterday, something that someone said yesterday in the past. So I'm a big believer in, you spend 10% maybe thinking about yesterday and the rest thinking about today and tomorrow. Always kind of shifting into what's next. And also thinking in terms of what if. That's a really powerful question. What if? And that's where I get a lot of my ideas. I just dream. What if we, and just kind of go from there. And then you take that what if, it becomes a vision, and then eventually you bring it to execution, right? Yeah.
I love that. So I also do journaling, and then as you mentioned, first of all, every morning, I gonna ask myself, what was the at least 3 good things from yesterday? Because I want to compliment myself, because of as a Japanese mindset, we tend to be negative too much. So okay, I got up at 6. Yes, I cooked myself. Yes, I worked in 1 hour. Yes, wow, I am a good person. Like that, like
Nice.
compliment myself. Okay, and then after I became stable, I started to like kind of a brainstorm on what, and also organizing what is my to-do list. This is number 1, number 2, blah, blah, blah. And also, as you mentioned, what if, for example, in January, I will be in Tokyo. Why not? I want to help people. Why not? I ask some organization to collaborate and host some like just a 2-hour event like that.
Yeah, that's another great question. Why not? Why not, right? So why not, open this idea of possibility? What if? Open up the idea of possibility, right? So, I'm a big believer in the power of language. And in my book, I write a little bit about this. I discovered this as a leader, but it's so true for yourself in your own life, whether you're leading people or not. The language you use becomes you. Right? So if you're using positive language, you become positive and it brings positive energy. And again, I'm leaning a little bit back to spirituality and science. And there's evidence that when we speak, that there's a process in our mind, right? Before we actually say the word, we're imagining the word, positive or negative. And then we say the word, right? And then that word creates vibration. And it comes right back into here. And it digests. So whenever we use negative language, it creates a negative cycle. And of course, around us as well. Nobody feels good when they hear negative language around them, right? You can't do this, it's impossible, and so on. Versus positive language, it creates a positive vibe around you and inside you. So I think I became quite disciplined about the language that I use. It has to be pure, it has to be genuine. Everybody's human. We have good days and bad days. But I think it's really important to think carefully about the language you use. If you're trying to, be better than yesterday, if you're individually, or if you're trying to build a great team, a great organization, the language you use is critical in order to create a positive environment.
I love that. And then, Paul, speaking of positive language, you started to Monday Mantra series, right? This is amazing. Your new, habit. Please let us know about it.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, come on, it's nothing compared to what you do. I'm a total amateur, but again, this is, I guess, something I discovered in India. The idea of mantras, right? And mantra, you can go really deep and spiritual with it, but for me, it's more simple. It's just like a catchphrase, or just words that kind of keep you motivated and on track and moving forward. And sometimes really simple. Like, for example, if I'm caught in traffic in Bangalore and my Google map says all red, normally it would take me 10 minutes, but it's raining, it's going to take me 45 minutes or an hour or even longer. There's a moment there where you have a choice. You can get frustrated, or you can say, never hurry, never worry. It's a simple mantra. So whenever I'm in a situation where it's beyond my control, and for example, I'm going to be running behind or whatever, never hurry, never worry, deep breath. But then we can get into leadership as well. For example, simple mantras like Wayne Gretzky, the ice hockey player, said, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So take the shot." Right? You can't score if you don't shoot. You got to take the shot. So take the shot. So in life, we got to just try. So what I did was I thought, okay, I'll list up all of these isms, call them mantras, but isms that I like. Some are borrowed, some are ones I created. And I've created, every Monday morning, I've created a series of what I call the Monday Mantra, and I release it across TikTok and Instagram and so on, social media. And it's become pretty popular already. I've only done a few so far. And what I like to do is when it comes to me, so I was in Korea a couple weeks ago, was out on the town, and then I just had a couple come to me, and then boom, filmed it and put in the subtitles and upload it. and getting a lot of really positive response. So Instagram every Monday morning, X and TikTok. I'll probably start putting it on LinkedIn on the videos as well. Yeah.
Amazing. So I'm gonna put one of the video and link. So please check it. Okay. So last question, Paul. Tell us about your next milestone in 2025.
Well, I have a few. Thank you. I'm actually crafting that now. This is what I do every year. Kind of finish the year with, all right, what's next, right? And looking at 2025. Well, first I want to look back, as I said earlier. And it's been quite a year. I mean, it was a year of transition, and the transition has happened. And I'm actually feeling pretty comfortable in this transition now. Now it's about accelerating impact. So next year is really about, or 2025, sorry, is really about acceleration of impact. I definitely, when I measure the things I want to do, there's certain things I want to do. Certainly I want to get the book released in Korean next year, get my book released in Hindi. I want to continue with the enabling efforts I'm doing on helping leaders and organizations be future ready. What I'd really like to do is do more and more workshops in Japan for teams. So for teams of leaders at any level. It could be from, junior manager level to senior executives, but take those teams offsite, do workshops where we can really help them build those muscles to be future ready. That's something I really want to dive into and do more of. And I'll continue to do coaching and so on. Healthy, of course, and Kaori, one of my biggest passions is hockey, right? Ice hockey.
Yes.
So I want to keep playing hockey, and also every January, pretty soon, be heading off to the Himalayas for our annual trip. And this is really important to me. This is part of the do well, do good, where we use sport to build life skills, community, economies, and so on. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And then, so since I am some like a bridge between San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Tokyo, so when you do some workshop or event, I'm gonna volunteer you. Please let me know.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the help. That's and this is the beauty of, I'll say another mantra, by the way. 1 + 1 is 3.
Yay! Not the
Right?
two.
1 + 1 is 3. You know why? Because when two people sit together and they use language like yes and, not yeah but yes and, it's like playing ping pong, right?
Yeah.
When you play ping pong with someone with ideas, new ideas are born, and that's where the game changes, right? And how many times have we sat in a cafe with a friend or a colleague and you brainstorm an idea and you write it on the back of a napkin, and then you go out and you do it? I mean, that's an amazing moment. So yeah, 1 + 1 is 3. Maybe that's today's mantra.
Yay!
Yeah.
Today's mantra.
1 + 1 is 3.
Yes, and also like plus is like to do X, and then like more, right?
Yeah, scalable. That's right. Multiplier effect. That's true. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Anyway, Paul, thank you so much for your amazing wisdom today. I'm so happy to publish our conversation to the world.
Well, thank you for having me. And again, I really love what you're doing. You're always stepping out of your comfort zone, doing new things, and thank you. And hope everyone enjoyed the conversation today.
Yeah. Okay. Bye bye. Thank you so much. The 3 key takeaways from Conversation Paul Part 2. Okay. 1. Entrepreneurship opens new opportunities through openness. Paul shared the how stepping into entrepreneurship expand his world, allowing unexpected opportunities to arise. For example, he spoke about the importance of being open to new ideas and connections, which led to collaboration like his leadership workshops and international book launches. His approach demonstrates that embracing the unknown can lead to exciting and meaningful projects. Prioritization is key. Focus on the rocks. Paul uses the rocks and pebbles framework to maintain focus on what truly matters by identifying 3 to 4 major priorities each day. The rocks. He ensures progress to impactful tasks that align with his purpose, such as enabling leaders and organizing workshops. This strategy helps avoid the common pitfall of getting overwhelmed by less critical tasks. 3. Inspiring leadership through Monday mantras. Paul launches his Monday Mantra series to share wisdom and motivation in a quick, relatable format. These short video clips shared on social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok deliver concise yet impactful message. This creative initiative reflects Paul's missions to inspire leaders and individuals to embrace positivity and purposeful action in their daily lives. Okay, thank you so much for watching our podcast today. We hope our conversation will help your future and career. If you like this episode, please subscribe it and give you a like. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。